Today I attended the funeral of my friend Tim Dellinger. My thoughts on Tim and the day in general on this episode of the Driving with Rob podcast. Tim Dellinger was a man that I knew for most of my life. We went to elementary school together at Rock Springs Elementary School. I've known Tim most of my life. And at this point, that's a long time. And as I was thinking about the service and the day and going to pay my respects to the family, I got to thinking about how Tim and his family were from here. And that may seem like an odd thing to say if you're not from here. But there have been so many people over the last 50 years that have moved into this area. But Tim and his family, just like my family, have been here for generations. I live just a few miles away from where my great-grandfather lived. And Tim's great-grandfather was from here too. And that was just one of the reasons that I felt a kinship with Tim. And just one of the reasons that I felt like that I really should be there. That I really should be there for this service. Because it was hometown people, the whole family. And Tim was my friend. We went to elementary school together. We went to high school together. We even worked together right after high school when we were 18, 19, 20 years old. And even though we were friends, we didn't hang out that much. But I never doubted for a second that Tim was my friend. And things I remember about Tim growing up, Tim was always better at sports than I was. He was always a better softball player, baseball player than I was. An avid golfer. He was on the golf team I think we had one in junior high. There was a golf team in junior high and a golf team in high school. And he was a pretty good golfer and kept his love of golf his whole life. And was actually pretty good. And I remember especially in junior high, I was a little jealous of Tim because Tim always had pretty girls around him. And back in those days, I was way too shy to approach a pretty girl. Pretty girls were just too intimidating for me. But Tim always had pretty girls around him. And I didn't find out for years later that the main reason Tim had pretty girls around him all the time is because they were his sisters and cousins. He just had really pretty sisters and cousins. And as pretty girls are, they tend to hang out together. So the friends of his cousins were always around. It wasn't because Tim was a lady killer or had so much personal magnetism. He just always had pretty girls around him because he was related to most of them. But when we were 12, 13, 14 years old, I was a little jealous. But later on, as we grew up, we graduated high school. And we worked together for 2 or 3 years. He got a job with the power company. I got a job with the radio station. And, we kind of went our separate ways. And then later on, we kind of reconnected. Again, he started going to the same church that I went to. So we kind of reconnected and we would run into each other because if you're from this community, and this community is not as small as it used to be, but you still can't help but run into each other at the grocery store, at the gas station, Walmart. We invariably ran into each other. And every time I would run into Tim, you would always see that smile. The same smile Tim had when he was a little boy. He just carried that smile with him all the time. He just always seemed happy and smiling. And we would usually hug each other and say, "How have you been? It's good to see you. How are things going?" Ran into him one time and he was telling me about his grandchild, his first grandchild. And I said, "Yeah, I've got high hopes for grandchildren myself. I didn't have any at the time." But the one thing that I remember about Tim, and I really didn't think about it. I'd never really thought about it before until I heard one of the speakers at the funeral mention the fact that Tim had the gift of encouragement. And like most good church people know, you know the gifts of the Spirit. The gift of teaching, the gift of prophesying, the gift of this, the gift of that. The gift of encouragement was what Tim had. And I never really thought about it before today. That was Tim's gift. Tim was able to encourage others. If Tim was a friend of yours, Tim was your biggest cheerleader. Tim was always the first person to encourage you and say, you can do it. What are you up to lately? Well, I know you're going to be great at it. I know you can do this. That was the kind of person Tim was. And there were a lot of speakers at the service today. One of Tim's kids spoke. A coworker spoke. A family friend spoke. His best friend. 2 pastors. And I don't remember which one said it, but it just struck me when they said, Tim has the gift of encouragement. And the last time Tim and I were together, we had gone to hear John Sullivan sing at a local pub microbrewery. A guy named John Sullivan. John Sullivan was on the TV show The Voice. And he was kind of a local hero because he was on national TV. And he was going to be singing locally, so we decided to go watch him and hear him sing, and ran into Tim. And as we had done dozens of times before, how are you? Good to see you. How have you been? How are things going for you? How's the grandbaby? And Tim said, what are you guys doing up here? And I said, we came to see John Sullivan. Tim said, would you like to meet him? I said, yeah, I'd love to meet him. So John had just finished a set, and he had come down off the stage, and Tim took me over to me, introduced me to him. Tim put his arm around my shoulder and said, this is my friend, and he's hilarious. And John just kind of smiled, and he said, really? And Tim said, yeah, he cracks me up every time I'm around him. He said, I love this guy. He makes me laugh every time we're together. And I got to thinking about that. Spiritual gift of encouragement. That's just the kind of guy that Tim was. And not meaning to preach at you too much, but I'll preach at you a little bit. Tim had the gift of what the King James Version calls the gift of exhortation. And exhortation and encouragement are kind of the same kind of a word. They both come from the root word parakletos, which is related to the word paraclete, which is where the word comforter comes from. When the Bible refers to the Holy Spirit as the comforter, it is the paraclete. Para literally means side by side. That's where we get the word parallel from, the word parachute from, to come alongside. But then parakletos means that you not only come alongside, but you help and encourage standing side by side with someone else. That's an encourager. And Tim was a Christian, and I have no doubt that Tim closed his eyes on this earth and opened his eyes in heaven. And that when my time comes, and I go to heaven, and I go to meet Jesus, that Tim will come alongside me and put his arm around my shoulder and say, Lord, I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. And he's hilarious. Rest in peace, Tim. We're going to miss you. And that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast, remembering my friend, Tim Dellinger. And I hope if you're hearing this and you are friends of Tim's or friends of his family, if you would share it with them and let them hear it. And if you'd like to listen to other podcast episodes, all you have to do is go to Google and look up the Driving with Rob podcast. My podcast hosting service is Podbean, but you can also find me on Spotify, iTunes, any place you go to listen to podcasts. And if you like the podcast, please share it with friends. If you like it, they probably will too. Thanks for downloading. Thanks for listening. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye now.